All right, this is Chapter 4, Plant Structures and Functions. So for your objectives today, or your learning targets, you've explained the system used to classify plants, understand how the binomial plant naming system works, identify the families of flowers and leaves that are often used in floral design, describe the anatomy of flowers and leaves, and summarize plant physiology. So for the introduction here, it's basically floral materials are living, growing, and changing. Some of the plants, even after they've been cut, can still grow. We also rely on people to produce these plants and have to have an understanding of how the plant functions. And we also want to be able to use the materials to their fullest potential. So basic qualities it talks on here about plant morphology, the external plant color, plant structure, the color, leaf size, shape, and edges of it. It all kind of gives it a unique look, but it can also have a unique purpose for that plant. So for the basic anatomy, they have, can you identify each plant, each part of the plant's anatomy? So some of this, especially, I love that it's a pepper plant. We don't do much with peppers in floriculture. But if you look at the top part, that's the stuff we're typically worried about. We don't typically look at much of this stuff unless you're selling houseplants. But you should at least know this is, the upper part of the plant. This is where the root structure is. So we'll go to the next slide here. This is showing you flowers, auxiliary buds, petiole, node, internode, fruit, the basic stem. Stem is what we're really going to be worried about with cutting plants. And then you have the primary root and then lateral root. So the primary root is basically that anchoring piece too. The top bud here, that terminal bud, some of our plants, if we clip that off, like if it's a tree, it will no longer grow upward. It's only going to grow outward, which can make it look kind of unique. Taxonomy, you guys should have learned this in biology. If you haven't taken biology yet, you will learn it. Your basic piece you need to understand for our purposes is the fact that if you're looking at a plant, that genus and species name, which is always italicized, that is going to be what we typically look at to identify plants specifically. For our purposes, we're going to use the common name. But that's the whole process of classification of organisms. It was developed by Carolus Linnaeus. And then we talk about plant families. Typically with plant families, these are plants that are really similar to each other. They have similar needs, similar characteristics. So if you hear someone say, oh, it's in the Brassica family, they're talking about a group of plants that have similar needs. They have typically the same structure, stem and leaf shapes, similar flowers, and fragrance similarities. Like I said, genus and species, that's what you're going to see. That's italicized. And it's necessary to identify, especially if you're going to go on and learn more about plants, you will definitely get into the scientific name piece. But like I said, for our purposes, common names are good. So this image, they're showing you basically this one's a rose they took and chopped in half. This is a tulip that they chopped in half. So they're asking you to identify the parts. Well, it's kind of hard because they took and chopped it in half. But if you look, the tulip one's a little bit easier. So this white piece here, that's the female part. That's actually going to be sticky on the top. This is the stamens, which is the male part. There's several of those. These are going to have the pollen grains on top. And when the wind blows or a bird comes along, it causes this plant to shake and it causes the pollen grains to land on this sticky top called the stigma. So that is a complete flower. Incomplete flowers are going to be missing parts. And then there's some that only have, so the incomplete may be male or female, which is kind of unique. So this is the pistil, which is the female part. All 6 of these are actually stamen, which are the male parts. Inflorescence, that is a fancy way of saying that all of these are different shapes. So even though you may not care about the arrangement of the flowers on the stem, that's what inflorescence basically is. And when you look at different flowers, you may see these shapes to them. So this one kind of reminds me of baby's breath. And it's kind of important to know when you buy, say if I call a floral supplier and say, I need a stem of baby's breath. Well, I'm going to get something like this instead of something like that. So it kind of gives me a better idea of what I would need to order. So the leaves themselves, they're showing you, this is a sugar maple. a unique trait about maples. Sugar maples make a U right here. Silver maples make a V shape, so kind of cool. But they're talking about the leaf margin, the veins, the midrib. The whole purpose of a leaf on a plant is to perform the process of photosynthesis, which is on the next slide. But the other piece to note about leaves, when they talk about the margin, that kind of gives it its unique characteristics and has the shape to the leaf, also helps us identify plants really well. This is basically if you blew apart the leaf, it shows you the layers inside. It's kind of cool. It shows you the chlorophyll and everything, which is basically the food production area. If you look at this, they're talking about photosynthesis. Obviously, there's a whole lot going on in a plant that we really don't pay much attention to. So the roots, they're absorbing water, nutrients. The leaves themselves are absorbing sunlight to try to make, that sun energy into sugars, basically acting as a food source for the plant. They're also taking in carbon dioxide and giving off oxygen. So if you want some clean air in your house, you get yourself some house plants. So that's why we have such a good relationship with plants too. Leaf shape and arrangement, there's many different patterns, texture. They call venation is a really fancy way of saying like these lines in here. They call them all veins that you can faintly see. Basically that's, if you think about how our veins work in our body and how they supply, they help our blood travel, but they also help get nutrients throughout the body. That's kind of what your veins in a plant are doing too. They also have unique shapes like I already talked about. This right here is actually the stem attachment too. They also have different surface qualities. All right, this picture is showing you if I took and chopped a whole bunch of stems. Maybe it's asparagus or something like that. Who knows? It could be a whole hunk of flowers. Basically, those stems are a vascular bundle, and if you notice, these are not crushed at all, which is good because if you crush a stem on a flower, you basically murdered it because it can't absorb water anymore. Yes, we are cutting it off from its main food source, but it still has a little bit of a shelf life that it looks beautiful. But it also provides for support for flowers and leaves. It's very important to the plant in a whole nutshell. All right, this is some of the interesting stuff too. If you look at the stem, they have little nodes. So this is a carnation that they have on this slide. The space between the nodes is called the internode. Right here is a node. So if I was actually going to take this carnation and make a cutting and try to make it root, I would cut it below that node, put in some rooting hormone and stick it in some soil and see if it would root for me. But that's that growth point is the node. So basically once you chop it off, you basically force that plant to find a new way to survive and it shoots out roots from the node. I told you that in between the nodes. And if I'm going to cut this and put it in arrangement, I'm not going to cut at the node because it's a thicker spot on the stem. I'm going to cut it down here where it's thinner. The rhizome part is going to be the roots, and we'll see roots on the next slide here. So if I am looking at this one, it's trying to show me this is the shoot of the plant, this is the root. The root, their main job is to support and anchor the plant. If you have erosion issues, you may have heard that people suggest to plant grass or trees or something to help prevent that problem. They also carry water and minerals, life support right there. They store food and minerals too. They also store carbohydrates. They also you can do vegetative reproduction. You may have some plants in your yard, like if you have hostas, if you have lilies, if you have tulips too, even tulips are a bulb though. But these plants will actually make more and more roots that are rhizomes. You can dig the whole thing up, but if you dig them up, make sure you don't chop here. You're going to dig all the way around. Dig it up, and then you can cut or even maybe tease apart sections of it without cutting. Because eventually what will happen, these plants grow to the point where they almost suffocate themselves, and then they just aren't going to come back anymore. That's also a form of propagation when you take those apart and make more plants out of it. So kind of cool stuff. We're not going to get into much propagation in floral design. We're going to do more of that in greenhouse management. So if you're interested in that stuff, which is kind of cool, that's where we do that. This is showing you different types of roots. So like we're talking about, this is a tulip bulb. Those come up early in the spring, planted in the fall typically. This is a dahlia root. This is freesia, which is called a corm. Tubers, they kind of remind me, they're like potatoes. They kind of remind me more of ginger if you buy fresh ginger in the store. and then this is a tuberous daylily. They kind of have almost looks like an octopus sort of root structure to them, but they typically will grow a whole bunch of them in one wad, and you can see like there's all these little root hairs. They're trying to grab onto soil, and if they don't find soil, they might grab onto the other plants, and that's how they basically suffocate each other. Here's ginger. So there's that example of ginger that kind of looks like, they call it a rhizome on here. Taproots, dandelions, I don't know about you, but if you can pull up the root of a dandelion, that's one of the most pleasing things, and part of it is my grandpa had a hatred for dandelions. But if you get the whole root, hopefully that doesn't come back. So most of us see dandelions as a weed. Some people think they're pretty. And this is of fibrous roots. Fibrous roots are really tiny, they're thin, they're not super strong, and you typically find them on your annual type plants. Those bedding plants that you have to replant every year. Plant physiology, the fancy word there, physiology just means the way something functions. So this is why it says plant functions here. So you can see this is a seed. It's going to start sprouting. They call that process germination. It's going to start to form roots. And the super cool part I always think about seeds is the fact that you can't really plant them upside down. So as it sprouts, it's going to find, if you don't plant it too deep, that is, it's going to find sunlight and start to grow. And it's going to start to produce roots. And this is actually showing that it's a cotton boll or a cotton plant. So these flowers on a cotton plant actually turn into the boll at the end when they are fully ripened. So it's kind of cool to see. And then over time, it's going to turn into a seed pod because it's dried up. But very interesting stuff, the whole plant physiology piece. And then this last slide here is transpiration. That whole process is basically the plant losing moisture. It's got a whole bunch of words on here, but basically what I'm going to tell you is it's the plant losing moisture. That's a big thing in the floral industry. So the hard part is if I have a floral arrangement, I have to deliver it. I'm not going to soak everything with water terribly. I might do that when I get it to location depending on what's going on. I'm going to make sure that that foam is soaked, the arrangement's made nicely, and then when I get there I might add more water to it, or I might tell who I deliver it to, hey, this thing is going to need water or it's not going to look pretty. So lots of cool stuff if you look at chapter 4 and the whole plant anatomy piece. Plants are super cool, and I know it's not as easy to get excited about as it is maybe a furry animal, but your plants do us a lot of different services. In our purposes for floral design, we're thinking about, oh, they look pretty. Well, to make them look pretty, it's good to know more about them. And we'll learn more about caring for cut flowers there's a chapter about post-harvest. So that's, the flower is grown, you're cutting it, that's post-harvest. So that's chapter 4 in a nutshell, and we'll talk to you again soon.